Welcome to Under the Microscope. I am your host, Jenny Germano. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Today's topic is the top compliance mistakes operators make and how to prevent them. And before I dive in, a little bit about my background. I got my start working in cannabis operations back in 2009 in Colorado. And in 2015, I founded my company, ICS Consulting, and I've been helping operators navigate the regulatory landscape and challenges across the United States for the last 10 years. I'm going to be discussing the top 10 violations across the United States in cannabis operations. I was thinking about different ways to approach this. Obviously, doing an episode about violations can be broken down into so many different segments or and areas, but I wanted to do this broadly. I'm not going to be naming any companies or anything like that and just try to keep it really simple and clean just for learning purposes and education. So, the compliance risk in cannabis, it's really not a myth. And I've got some stats here I want to talk about. I did some research to share with you today. In 2024, regulators across 29 states, including DC, issued 2,500 violations to regulated licensed cannabis operators. That's almost 7 a day nationwide. One state in particular, Michigan, they accounted for over a third of the violations. So Michigan is handing out right now, currently, the most violations in any state in the US national market. So why does this matter? It highlights some of the breakdown or the lack of systems in cannabis operations once they're licensed and become operational. It seems that everybody does a good job to cross that threshold of winning the license, going through the application process, and there's bumpers in place that's keeping everyone in line, and then they pass their inspection. Maybe they're awarded their conditional license, and they still have to pass all these specific areas before they're given the green light to sell, cultivate, or produce, or transport, or as well as test if they're a testing facility. But it seems that once everybody gets past this part and they're all off on their own, and then they're just basically subject to random surprise inspections by the regulators, maybe like on an annual basis. And in some places, they do not see the regulators for almost 2 years or longer if they're not even on their radar. And then what happens is some of these facilities can be complacent, or maybe they're having a lot of turnover, or currently with the constriction of the market in some states, people are having to lay off or let go their compliance team or compliance officer or their safety manager, and they don't have all the site controls in place anymore. And then that's when the cracks begin to show. Some of the biggest categories regarding these violations are operational failures and record keeping lapses. These are areas that operators are touching in their businesses almost daily. So, what did these violations add up to in the US last year? So basically, they totaled more than $10 million in fines last year. This is for 2024. On average, violations in Michigan that led fines to cost operators about $6,500 each. Even in states with more mature markets, like Colorado, 1 in every 4 tested products had THC content off by more than 20% from the label. That kind of mislabeling can trigger recalls, lawsuits, or even worse, revocation of the license, basically being shut down and having your license revoked. Just wanted to give a little shout out on the data I looked up. I pulled these stats from the 2024 report from the Cannabis Risk Manager, who tracks enforcement actions nationwide. From everything that I shared, there's a lot of different ways to unpack it. This episode is not going to be about lab testing today, although it is a topic that I am working on nailing down and bringing some guest experts on because it is not my area of expertise when it comes to some of the failures that we're seeing across the country in labs. But it is going to be a topic that I do want to tackle with the help of an expert guest. So let's go ahead and dive in. I have the top 10 violations right now in the United States. This is with licensed cannabis operators. So, number one, this is going to be with track and trace. This is a seed to sale software that is mandated by the state, whether they're using Metric or BioTrack or all the other seed to sale track and trace softwares out there. Some states have their own track and trace software that they're implementing. Why are these violations happening? The number one reason is bad data in and bad data out. For everyone that's ever heard that term, garbage in, garbage out, what that means. When you're not entering in items correctly, doing data entry, and with seed to sale tracking, there is a lot of data entry that's happening. If you're putting in not the correct information, then that not correct information will be coming out on the other end of that system. And then it's a domino effect, whether you're getting flagged on the back end by that regulatory agency, whether it's causing discrepancies in your tracking system versus maybe what you have in your POS system, or it's not matching your physical inventory. What happens is, like I said, we get a mismatch inventory. This is our physical versus what our seed to sale tracking software is telling us. But then also we have the integration with the POS system and what that's telling us. And also rushed entries, bad SOPs, lack of reconciliation, and lack of training. I find a lot of times that a lot of the metric or the seed to sale tracking mistakes that are happening, there's a couple variables. One, they're new, brand new. They've never worked in the cannabis industry and they're learning their software. And yes, they've taken the training through the online portal. And when they go to sit down and work on everything, it's still a little confusing, or they're not getting support from their POS system and how that's reflecting back through the integration into the metric system is a lot of the cases that I see come up. People are rushed, they're moving very fast. Once again, that lack of training, just really making sure that you have a role-based trained metric administrator or seed to sale administrator working in that software. And then also too, poor communications. When we get into cultivation facilities, we have all these different phases that the plant goes through versus when it's in processing or production or like a manufacturing facility. For a dispensary, they're getting the products coming to the dispensary. They have to accept the product into their software. But a lot of times the mistakes can happen from when, even though a lot of software companies will say, oh, it will dump your inventory into the POS system. Yes, it will do that. However, it will not do the work for you. If you're brand new and you're getting inventory for the first time, you're still going to have to create the product in your POS system. You're going to have naming conventions. You're going to have to label things the correct way. And you're still going to have to bring it over the correct way every single time. And a lot of times there can be confusion or things aren't brought over the same way, or the naming conventions are incorrect, or the pricing is off. And so just a lot of different things can happen that can cause confusion when it comes to the dispensary side. But once again, on the dispensary, it is a package. For example, 12 chocolate bars is under one package tag that is coming over. But when we get into the cultivation side, it can be even actually, there's a lot more for the moving pieces. You have plants that are clones, depending on what state you're in. You might not even have to track those clones because plants are tracked based on their size. And then you have them in veg, and then they go from veg, and then they move flower, and then once they're in flower, they get harvested, and then they get harvested, and those raw materials get broken down into where you have complete waste. And don't forget also in veg or flower, any kind of defanning or defoliating that's happening and pulling off fan leaves and all that stuff that's happening in those processes. So now you get into where you're breaking the plant down, you've already harvested your crop, and then you have things like stalks and stems and root balls and trim and what's getting saved for processing, what's going where, whether it's going to be trim or your bulk flour or if it's popcorn. Sometimes cultivation facilities break their flour down into a couple categories where they have like their A grade, their B grade, and their C grade, and then they get into the popcorn, and then they get into the trim. And then sometimes a lot of that gets sold to the manufacturers and other people buying wholesale, whether some dispensaries might want to sell trim, especially to their patients. A lot of times, medical patients like to buy trim because they like making their own edibles at home. So it just really depends how that plant is getting broken up. But I think the cultivation facility, it has the most things that happen to it, and then it gets purchased by either the dispensary, it's either packaged or it's sent wholesale bulk flour, or it's in the form of a pre-roll, like I said, or that pre-packaged, depending on what state you're in. Obviously, we have state rules and regs. And then when we go to manufacturing, they could either already be getting that packaged, or when you get into the manufacturing, they're just buying wholesale flour and trim. And then don't forget fresh frozen, depending on what they're making. And then that manufacturer could be blasting it for concentrates, making edibles, turning it into tinctures or lotions, as well as they could be white labeling for dispensaries or other manufacturers. They could be selling oil that they're making to other manufacturers that they're using as part of their recipe. It's almost like a spider web that happens. And so that is all getting tracked in the seed to sale. And so imagine if you're rushed and you have bad data happening, then that's going to affect all those moving parts in that spider web when it comes to the track and trace. And I think that's probably why that's the number one violation that we see across the United States. I think it's a struggle for the industry still. And there's so many things that affect it. Turnover, training, that business owner not having enough knowledge or not having enough money to pay a person who's really good at metric, not getting outside help or third party like a metric consultant or expert coming in, or not even taking the training that seed to sale software or metric offers online and just doing the bare minimum. And what I see the most is that people get put who do not have the skill set to do data entry or to manage inventory get thrown into the abyss of the inventory system and these administrative functions. We have people who are brilliant at cultivating and growing and have so much knowledge about the plant, and that's what they're really good at. And then we throw them into these administrative systems. That's not their skill set. And so that can be a challenge, and just not having the right people in place. And I think that's why that violation happens a lot. Later on, once I get through this list, I'm going to cover some best practices for these top 10. So, number two And the top 10 violations for cannabis operators across the United States: poor record keeping and inventory reconciliation. So, why does this happen? We have decentralized records, unclear ownership of task, and I would say inventory reconciliation. When we get to this piece, I think a lot of times that happens is because people are not reconciling their inventory system by the end of the business day. And I would say, in probably 85 to 90% of the rules and regulations across the United States, specifically because Metric is obviously the more common seed to sale tracking software that's mandated by regulatory agencies, that percentage, those regulations, it is required that you reconcile by the end of the business day. In some states, it might just be a best practice, but in most states, they do have it written into the rules that you have to reconcile your inventory. What does that mean? That means that you have a 100% idea of what inventory is on hand, that you've accepted all your manifest, that you have counted any brand new inventory that has come into the system, that you are taking responsibility and are physically counting your inventory and making sure it matches up with what is in the system, in your POS system or the CD sale tracking system, and that it's matching up to the sales that you're reporting to the state. I see a lot of really poor record keeping happening when I go in and audit facilities. I would say a couple things around poor record keeping is that records are not maintained in a professional business manner. And not everybody has the skill set, right? If you did not run a business prior or work in a regulated industry, I had a regulator once tell me, this was like a couple years back when I was in DC. She was a previous regulator in that area. And she had said, you can really tell who has not operated in a regulated industry before by how they keep their records. And it is really true. I hear that feedback a lot from regulators that records are not maintained or kept in a professional manner. They're random and all over the place, and nobody has a central location for where they're keeping records. They don't have a management system. Whereas if somebody came from healthcare or the pharmaceutical side of things, they have massive systems in place for how records are managed. And we're not quite there yet in the cannabis industry. This is a common violation a lot of times too, where people are missing required records and they're not doing a good job of maintaining them. Another piece that I've seen is retention periods are not being followed. Some operators do not fully understand how long they are retaining records, whether they are off-site or on-site. Sometimes in some states, it's on-site for 6 months, but maintained for 3 years, meaning you can maintain those records off-site for 3 years. I've been in places where they mistakenly shredded records, and I know the intention was 100% the best intention that they had because, 1, they shredded it. They were trying to protect they were trying to protect the records by using the shredder, but the problem was they weren't paying attention to the retention requirement. It's just really important. If there's record keeping requirements where this is 1 year and this is 3 years and this is 5 years, there's nothing wrong with just saying, "Hey," depending on what state you're in, if you're in a state where that record has to be kept, the highest retention rate is 3 years, you could keep everything for 3 years then. Just keep everything for 3 years so there's no confusion and people aren't shredding records. You can keep them off-site, keep them on the cloud, or just find a way to keep them protected. I would say when we get into medical records, I would follow HIPAA recommendation for all patient records on the medical side of cannabis. And then when we get into sales tax and anything around sales or money, wholesale, follow the IRS record keeping requirements. But yeah, I think that some of those things come up and people they get hit because they get confused or they mix up the retention or they just have poor record keeping management. The next violation is going to be for packaging and labeling mistakes. Why does this happen sometimes? Last minute label changes. We know this happens a lot. The mixing up of SKUs, bad template control, as well. If I've seen this a lot where companies have gotten violations because they are an MSO and they're operating in multiple states. And this could just be like a medium size MSO. Maybe they're like in 5 or 6 states and they got the labels mixed up between the states. They got the warning statements or the universal symbol messed up. Some of these labels are very strict. The universal symbol has to be in a specific place. Sometimes it has to be in color. Sometimes when we're talking about THC percentages, it has to be highlighted or in a box so it stands out on the labeling. And then you have the container versus the marketing label. And in some states, it requires everything that's on the container has to be on the marketing label. Can get very confusing. And so I can see why this would be the number 3 violation in the United States. Another thing that happens is the packaging is not child resistant or it's too appealing to minors. Also, sometimes what can happen is that company, whoever's using the packaging, they do not have the CR, the child resistant certificate that proves that it is child resistant packaging. So a regulator comes in and says, "Hey, let me see your CR certificate." And then that operator says, "What is that? I didn't even know I was supposed to have a child resistant certificate. I didn't even know I could get that from the packaging company." Or you're buying child resistant packaging from somebody who says they're child resistant, and that company cannot produce a CR certificate, which in that case, I would not purchase packaging from that company if they could not produce a legitimate CR certificate. Also, we have false or misleading claims on products. This is something that comes up really in newer markets that are making the transition from maybe a caregiver market over to a regulated commercial market. We see this in the very beginning, but you don't really see this too much in mature markets. And we definitely see this on the hemp side of the industry because it's not as scrutinized and under a microscope as when we get onto the THC, the marijuana side of being regulated in the cannabis industry. The fourth violation is security and surveillance failures. Why does this happen? We have blind spots with our cameras, we have obstruction, we have cameras not working properly, not just basically non-functional cameras. We have retention lapses, let's say in your state, 30 days, 40 days, 25 days, whatever it is that your state requires for retention. A regulator comes in and they say, "Show me 30 days," and they give you a date, and then you have to go back and show them. And all of a sudden, you're like, "I only have 10 days." And so something's going on with your system that it does not have enough memory, or I am not a DVR specialist here, but this happens a lot that they do not have the right retention amount on that DVR. Also, too, people can get in trouble for not knowing how to run their DVR. In most states, they will come in and they will make you walk them through on how you go back and show footage 30 days, 10 days, whatever, depending on what your state is, and also require you to show how to print a digital still, which is something that you would have to give to the police or the enforcement agency. And then also putting that video on a jump drive or like an external hard drive or a thumbnail drive, whatever you want to call it. And you would have to give that evidence to police or an investigation or whatnot if those records are being requested. And a lot of times, operators don't even know how to run their cameras properly, and that can land you with a violation, as well as missing footage. that's going to really send a lot of red flags to regulators if you're missing footage or if cameras are being unplugged or cameras are down or the angles are off. And so you have to think about how when the regulators come in, they're going to think, what's going on here? Why are these things happening? And I always like to try to help people understand it's important to have your facility in top shape. Because let's just say, and it's okay, some people have 2, 3 things they need to work on, and most regulators will always probably tell you they can always find something. They can always come in and find something and tell you that you need to improve on. But when you come into a facility and we start getting up there with 8, 10, 20, 30 violations, you better be prepared that they are gonna start peeling your business back like an onion, layer by layer, and they're gonna peel it back, and they're gonna look under everything. So it's really important for you as an operator or whoever's listening, if you're thinking about coming into this industry, that you really have a plan in place for compliance and auditing and checks and balances and understanding where your facility is at all times. I would say if everybody did that in the cannabis industry, we probably wouldn't have those statistics right now and $10 million in fines in 2024 for violations. So those are some of the violations I came across regarding security. The fifth violation is testing and lab COAs or certificate of analysis. Why are we having violations around testing? It's no secret if anyone's paying attention to any state in the United States that has regulated cannabis, we have things called recalls happening. We have adverse events, we have voluntary recalls, we have mandatory recalls. We have people maybe they're using unapproved labs, although that one would be a little tricky because everybody does have to be on the seed sale tracking system. I guess it just depends on what state that you're in. This could happen in states that maybe aren't on a very strict seed to sale system, as well as we have COA mismatches. We have manipulated results. We have selling untested or failed batches. We have people also that they're manipulating or falsifying test results. People do try to manipulate test samples. And this could be a whole entire episode when we start talking about test samples. It just depends who's handling your test samples. Is it an employee? Every state is different. In Colorado, the employees prepare the test samples. And if they send a lab to pick it up, they have to pick up the sample already prepared and ready to go. And then they pick it up and they go. They're not collecting, they're not going in and physically collecting the sample and doing random selection and whatnot for the testing, for the sample collection process. And in other states, operators are not allowed to touch their samples whatsoever, and the testing facilities come in and they prepare the test sample batches, and they have to put out the bins and they can't interfere, and the lab comes in, they have their process, and they come in and they do their sampling process, collect the samples and leave. What's the integrity in which those samples, the environment that they're in while they're being transported, and then once they get to the lab, and then how they're held. What are the standards that those testing facilities are using? Is that testing lab required to pass an ISO certification in that state? And are they following all the rules and regulations around record keeping requirements, tracking, logs? Once again, environment. So many things can cause a sample to fail a test, including cross contamination, environmental issues. So it's a big Pandora's box that I'm not going to open right now, but it is an area where we see a lot of violations. I would also like to say that people with the failure of tests, they get violations for not properly following process validation in a state, or they're missing one of the test samples for that process validation. We also have somebody using banned pesticides, but somehow miraculously they pass these tests, and this is where this manipulation could take place. And then they go and they pull that product sample off the shelf of the dispensary, and then it fails the test. So right now this is a hot topic in the cannabis industry on what's going on around testing. So number 6 violation in the United States is advertising and marketing. So how does this happen? A lot of times people don't fully understand. It just gets really tricky. They don't fully understand the state versus local rules. They're not checking in with their municipality. Every place is different. You have what the state says that you can do, and then we get into that local town ordinance and if they have any rules and regulations. And it's also the audience, knowing the percentage of people that are relatively above 21 and up in that community where that advertising, whether it's a radio ad or in the local newspaper or most places like a cannabis magazine is really safe. But if you're in a small town, how do you know that this is not getting in front of children and people under the age of 21? So that's something that's really important to think about. Some other areas as well when it comes to advertising is incorrect online ads without any required disclaimers. For example, in Colorado, if you have any ads around concentrates, there's a specific concentrate warning that has to be with that ad at all times. So you cannot advertise about concentrates without the warning, just like you would for tobacco and alcohol, those same kind of efficacy warnings. And then we also have the false therapeutic claims. And a lot of times people can get in trouble for this if they're advertising that the products are safe because they're tested, or this product cures cancer, although nobody really comes out and says that. This can help with motion sickness or morning sickness and all these different things, or sleep aid. It's even getting tricky around wording anything that gives you energy or helps you aid in sleep at night. You can get yourself into a lot of trouble. This is still a very gray area in how they're handing out violations. So, number 7 is going to be the age verification failures. This is really at the point of sale system. We're not seeing these age verification failures in manufacturing, cultivation, or transportation. It really comes down to the dispensary and the POS system and how they are checking IDs. So it happens because of poor training. Maybe this dispensary is very fast paced and there's lots of lines and they're trying to move through the lines at a fast pace. Fake IDs are overlooked and they don't have a 2-point inspection process. That's another reason why these things can happen, that they're not checking once with the receptionist and then checking it again before they make the sale at the POS. Typically, a 2-point inspection can really protect that dispensary, and in some cases, most states, they actually might require you to do a 2-point inspection. Number 8 is improper waste disposal and product destruction. So how does this happen? Once again, people are rushing, they're busy, they're running around like crazy. They're trying to make sure that they're getting things reconciled and inventory, and that's including waste. They have poor documentation, the wrong rendering methods, and this is true, this happens a lot. People do not review or read or utilize the approved rendering list. Most states will give you a list of approved items that you can render marijuana waste with. For example, sawdust, cardboard, non marijuana waste like trash, food, all kinds of things, newspaper. There's all these things that they'll list that you can mix with this non-marijuana waste list. It's really important to follow that list and make sure that you're adhering to it. And for example, I've found that people were using bleach. Well, in Colorado, bleach is not on the approved list. And some people will just pour a gallon of bleach over the edibles or the flour. Sure, it destroys the product so you can't consume it, but the product's still there. It's not really broken up or unrecognizable. And it's also dangerous if wildlife or domestic animals, or even if people break into your dumpster, which happens even when dumpsters are secure, get broken into, and people will tend to break into those trash bags knowing that you are a cannabis facility. Once again, this comes down to the regulations in your state, how you're required to secure waste. I always recommend keeping waste secured in the facility until the day it's getting picked up by the authorized company that is picking up your green waste. I think when you leave it in a dumpster, even if it's rendered unrecognizable, you risk people breaking into that dumpster and cutting your locks and scaling the fence or breaking into whatever they got to break into to get that waste. People, they think there's all this crazy amount of waste. Like companies are just dumping buds in trash bags and throwing them in dumpsters, which is just not happening. It's just trim and stems and expired products. So, you just wanna make sure that you're rendering things correctly, and that seems to be where people are getting into trouble with not rendering correctly. Also, missing waste logs, just the lack of not tracking waste properly. Depending on what seed-to-sale system that you're using, only certain waste is tracked in that seed-to-sale system, but not all waste. The rest of the waste is being tracked on logs. And if you have bad handwriting and the regulator comes in, they look at your log and they can't even read the handwriting, or you don't have the RFID tag number associated with that waste. And it just becomes this gray area where it's not being tracked properly. Also, some other areas people get in trouble around waste disposal is mixing hazardous materials with cannabis waste. Hazardous materials need to be dealt with separately from green waste. You need to be following your EPA regulations when it comes to disposing hazardous materials. You're not going to be saying, "Oh, I have this old bottle of pesticides that we're not gonna use anymore, and why not just I gotta get rid of all this green waste. Let me just dump this bottle of pesticides on this waste because I need to get rid of it." And so what happens is you end up breaking rules and regulations regarding the EPA. You cannot do that. It has to be appropriately done. You can't just dump old pesticides in a trash can. There are environmental rules and regulations around hazardous waste. And in some states, like for example, Missouri, they actually do have it in the rules and regulations, making sure that you're identifying like at what level is your hazardous waste that you have in your cannabis facility. So number 9, licensing, permits, and local zoning non-compliance. So how does this happen? A lot of times people assume that the permit says valid or they don't understand what conditional means and they think that they've applied, that they can start operating, not realizing they have to pass inspections. Maybe they didn't have an attorney or the right people helping them, and they just thought they could operate. They're also operating on expired licenses, revoked licenses. I've actually seen people operate on expired and revoked licenses. It actually recently just happened in Colorado. Somebody was selling product on a revoked license. Sometimes people lapse with their licensing and they forget to renew their license and they didn't get it renewed on time, and this whole time they were selling and producing and getting products to customers on an expired license. Also, they ignore any kind of local changes around any kind of local municipality, zoning changes, and so things like that can come up as well. Number 10 for the top 10 violations, our last one for the cannabis industry across the United States, is employee training, labor, and safety violations. So, also a little bit of OSHA in here. So, how does this happen? Lack of knowledge. Some people don't realize they actually have to follow OSHA in this industry. That is 100% truth. OSHA is in the cannabis industry and they are handing out violations. It is happening. You can do your research. The information is out there. Lack of documentation, lack of training, not having a safe workplace, employees working without the required training or badge credentials. We have unauthorized personnel entering restricted areas. We have slips, falls, or ergonomic injuries in cultivation facilities or manufacturing facilities. And then we have missing or incomplete training documentation. That's like the training pretty much in most of the cannabis industry. People have to have documentation that they had responsible vendor training. They were trained on all the equipment. They were trained on metric. They were trained on their SOPs. All that has to be documented. And that's pretty common in the cannabis industry. And I would say most all the states are rigorous about that. I'm just going to give an example of real consequences, case study, track and trace, and a fine. So, the situation, the plant relocations of missing tags and metric mismatches. So, it looks like they were relocating plants and they weren't relocating the plants properly in the metric system. They also had missing tags, and some of the tags were not aligning with physical inventory versus what was happening in the system. So it looks like the outcome there was a formal consent order, and they received a $3,000 fine and mandated corrective action. So they probably had to perform a CAPA, which is a corrective action. Our takeaway from this is small data slippage becomes a big regulatory risk. So, not having the right controls in place for that metric, that's the number one violation in the United States right now. Not having those processes in place can really add up and cost you a $3,000 fine. I'm going to talk about some best practices that operators can implement in these areas for track and trace and inventory. Some best practices would be to implement a daily reconciliation form. A lot of times, this is already in the POS system. They'll have this feature for dispensaries where they can compare and see here's what metric is saying, here's what my POS inventory is saying that you can do your physical inventory counts against. But when we get into manufacturing and cultivation, they use a different software. They're not using POS systems. They might be using an ERP or some kind of plant management software. And so you just want to make sure that everything is aligning up with physical versus the software that you're using. Also, you want to create any kind of variance log and track your variances. If you're reconciling in metric and you're updating amounts, obviously in metric, you're required to do notes. But if there are really big numbers, let's say you're reconciling anything over 400, 300 grams, you want to submit a metric ticket and probably involve metric to let them know what's going on. And especially if you're doing a clean of the system, you also should be scheduling monthly deep reconciliations that includes batches and pending transfers and waste. This should be done daily, but yeah, I agree. You should definitely go in and do a deep dive and look at everything, making sure all your packages are being closed out and everything's at zero and reconciled and looks nice and clean. There's nothing in the negative in your seed to sale tracking system. training. Whoever's doing your metric and your seed to sale inventory, they should go to training quarterly. Every 3 months, they can go into metric. They can go to metric anytime, but every 3 months, they have an educational portal that you can go into and watch the videos, because you have to do it every 3 months because things change, functions change. And there's also another way you can stay on top of metric is they have what they call these metric user groups. And they have these user groups where you can go in once a month and be part of a group of people who are using metric. And these are run by metric, and typically the state regulators are in there as well. And it's a great way to stay on top of all the changes, to try to promote changes in the system, get involved in your metric user group. Also, once in a while, metric will come to your state. They have a rep for each state, and they come in and throw a breakfast or a lunch where they invite all the licensed operators to come in. It's just for licensed operators. Nobody else can get into it. So you have to be associated with a specific license and have a badge, and I think they limit it to maybe 1 or 2 people from that company, and it's like a town hall. So I would look into seeing where that's happening in your state if you are on Metric. I don't know about the other softwares. Metric is the biggest one, that's why I know the most about Metric. The next one is gonna be record keeping, so some best practices around record keeping. You wanna have your records centralized. You want them all in one location. Gone are the days of filing cabinets. Filing cabinets are great. Maybe you'll utilize 2-drawer filing cabinet, 4, but I can't imagine beyond that. It's really important. Even if you're going to have physical records, you should have everything in a Google Drive or in a system. There's really secure systems out there. I don't know the names of all of them. When I've been doing audits, I've been in these systems that people are using where it's controlling all their records, their document management. It's also alerting them for all their renewals, a tracker for their licensing. It's important that you keep clean records, that everything is centralized. You could have a binder. I don't really like using a lot of binders anymore. There's really specific things I do for binders for inspections, but a digital binder is better. And then also have a table of contents. If you're going to have all your records kept digitally, create a table of contents and link all those records to the table of contents. So they come in, you open up your table of contents. They say, I need to see a copy of your last fire inspection record or your health department record, or I need to get access to your testing records, or I need to see your employee training records, and so on. I need to look at all your SOPs. You have this table of contents, which is like your matrix for your whole business, the complete document management system, and you click on that link and it takes you right to that document. And that way, you're doing it in under 5 minutes and you know where everything is, it's centralized. The regulators are going to love you. What they don't like is somebody who is unorganized, who can't present records in a professional manner and quickly. You can't have a regulator sitting there for 20 minutes waiting for you to find a record and you're buried into a physical filing cabinet. You have to do it in under 5 minutes. I think that's the best way to do it. So the next one is the labeling and packaging, some best practices. It just depends. So we have packaging from the grow, we have packaging from the manufacturer, and then we have packaging at the dispensary. All completely different. This is broad, is what I'm getting to. You want to introduce a label approval workflow that gets a compliance review and a final sign off before print. If a company sent you a proof of a label, you would have an approval process. You and everyone in the company look over it, you talk about it, you have your compliance officer look at it, making sure it's in compliance, and then you have approval. You should do the same thing no matter what you do, cultivation, manufacturing. or a dispensary. There should be an approval process for all your packaging and labeling. You want to keep a master label template library and version control. The next best practices are security and surveillance. You want to maintain a weekly check sheet. So if you, let's say you're using a security company, this is something a service they might provide. And typically they do where they're checking all the cameras, they're walking the perimeter, they're taking notes, they have logs. Also, they're logging conversations with the police department and so forth. And if you don't have that, you can keep your own logs and track those items yourself. You want to be checking your cameras, time stamped, if they're synced properly, as well as ensuring that you have the proper access control with limited access areas, badged employees, visitors, customers. For testing labs, some best practices: let's only use state approved labs. That should be pretty easy. Keep a lab qualification file. So this is accreditations or any recent audits, a copy of their current license, making sure that it's not expired. As an operator, you are responsible for making sure your vendors' licenses are not expired or revoked. As a QC, you can do research and development. You can also have a lab onboarding checklist, and you can get independent COA verifications as an additional step. For advertising and marketing, best practices: pre-approve all campaigns or social media through the compliance officer or the person in charge of compliance. Never target anyone under 21. Make sure that you're getting thorough reviews of all your packaging and labeling, those things that are going to be part of the advertising. As we all know, social media is tricky. Instagram and Facebook, people get shut down every single day in the cannabis industry. If you do not have a marketing department managing this, make sure this is getting run through your compliance person. For POS system, I would say making sure you implement that two-point inspection process I talked about, and you should have an ID scanner. I'm not a big fan of ID scanners on the phone. A lot of people are using apps on the phone. I think fake IDs can still get through those. You want to have the black light. You want to have a current ID book, or you can buy an age verification scanner, probably around $1,200. Sometimes the POS system has one that you can pay for, and those work really well. For waste disposal best practices, making sure that you have updated SOPs and people are following them. I would say 100% of licensed operators have to have a waste SOP in order to even win the license. If you're getting a violation, something's going wrong, meaning they're not following what's in the SOP or the SOP is outdated. Making sure, if people have messy handwriting, do the log in a spreadsheet. Don't do a physical piece of paper log. You could do it in Google Sheets and track it as a living document, or you have to have really good handwriting so the regulators can read these logs. You want to make sure that you have the proper methods implemented for the rendering and make sure we're following all the rules and regs and that everyone is properly trained. Licensing, permits, local zoning, and local compliance best practices. You want to maintain a renewal calendar. That's pretty basic. You could get all your renewals and notifications and just go through your Google Calendar, get them all set up, create alerts. That is the basic effective way of doing it. There's also a lot of these softwares nowadays as ERPs or POS systems or compliance softwares. A lot of them come with that licensing tool that help you track your licensing. Utilize that as well. You don't want to miss those licensing renewals. The next one is training and safety. Everyone needs to be trained. And it's not onboard employees and then never train them again. Employees should be trained quarterly. There's so much software out there, and these vendors, these manufacturing companies, they're doing such a great job. They make so many training videos for employees now and getting them trained on the product that they will train your employees on products. But you want to make sure everyone's up to date on responsible vendor training, any kind of compliance training, making sure that all role based training is taken care of. That means if I'm a bud tender or a trimmer, or I'm running metric, that I'm getting that role-based training. Keep really good training records. It's gonna save you. If you have an HR person or your payroll company, or if you have somebody, maybe your accountant or your controller, sometimes you can find different people that can help in these areas where they're tracking the training because there's a lot of people coming in or going. And you could probably have 5, 6 new employees in a year. So it's really important to track it and who's in charge of training in the company and making sure that trainer is tracking and there's logs and that all that's being tracked. That wraps up my best practices. Also, do want to put out there about creating some checklists. Here are some tips for checklists. You should have a daily metric or inventory, reconciliation, and sign off sheet, a weekly camera function, retention, spot checklist. If you have a security company, maybe they're doing this for you, but you can have your own. Also, you can have a checklist for before release of COA match and label QC. That way, you have quality control systems in place. Doing that once a month, deep reconciliation, waste destruction, and review. Like I said, quarterly training, completion. I would also say quarterly audits and mock inspections and drills for staff, that making sure they know how to handle an audit, they know how to handle emergencies, they know how to handle when regulators come in, they know how to interact and communicate with regulators, they're tracking the communication with regulators appropriately, and especially if the owners aren't operating on site, making sure that all that information is getting back to the executive level appropriately. It's really important to make sure that you have some kind of auditing process set up or an auditing schedule that is being done by that compliance person or that metric person. Every cannabis operation can follow compliance and can follow the rules and regulations. Compliance isn't just a single person's job. It's the entire company culture. That's why I'm always saying create a culture of compliance. All the things that I talked about today can either A, cause a breakdown in the compliance culture by not following these things and getting violations and not having systems set up, or you can continually build that culture of compliance by having these systems in place and that people are fully engaged in their job roles, but they're also being supported and that compliance is at the top of the list and not at the bottom of the list. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. I thought it would be an interesting topic to discuss some of the top violations happening in the cannabis industry. If you would like to listen to this podcast, it is streaming on Spotify, Apple, and iHeartRadio, or wherever that you like to listen. Please check out my YouTube channel. It is at Jenny Under the Microscope, and subscribe and follow my channel. Have a good day, everyone.